Are we ready? Okay. We're asking people to introduce themselves. So start with your name and then how you see yourself. Some people say they're an academic, they're an artist, they're an activist. I was going to say anyone. Some people are very loose about it and say they're a shit disturber, whatever it is. So it's however you choose to identify yourself. So name.
So my name is Morgan M. Page, and I'm a trans feminist performance and video artist and activist across Canada and the United States.
Okay. And Morgan, if you could tell us a bit about your work and how it addresses queer liberation.
Yeah, so I kind of come at my work through a few different means. First, I come at things as an activist, and most of my activism is centered around issues of decriminalizing sex work and decriminalizing HIV, and particularly locating these things as prime issues of importance to trans and queer people in North America. In addition to that, I'm involved in performance and video art, and a lot of my art, whether intentionally or unintentionally, includes a lot of my politics. And then the third layer is that I'm also a social service provider. So not only am I involved in activism kind of out and about in the world, I'm also involved in providing direct services and kind of putting my time and effort where my politics are to make sure that marginalized trans people and queer people have access to things to increase their sort of social determinants of health. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And can you share with us experiences, and as we were just talking about, activist-wise, artistically, as well as the service provision you offer the communities that you've had that you think is significant for how we think about queer liberation in theory and in practice?
Absolutely. So one of the most formative experiences in my getting into what you might call a queer liberationist politic was my involvement in the 2008 counter-protests against the Homewood-Maitland Safety Association, who were, and still are, a group of mostly white, middle-class, cisgender gay men who were harassing, stalking, and by some reports, allegedly attacking trans sex workers working in their neighborhood, the somewhat infamous Homewood-Maitland sex work stroll. And so I showed up to these protests and ended up taking on one of two leadership roles in 6 weeks of direct action against the Homewood-Maitland Safety Association, where myself and an activist, Wendy Babcock, would be out there from 11 p.m. till 4 a.m. every night at Homewood-Maitland, physically blocking these men from being able to harass and attack trans sex workers, as well as engaging them in dialogue about why what their actions were doing were problematic and not going to actually solve any of the problems that they claim to have. I think this is particularly interesting when we think about queer liberationist politics, because often queer liberationist politics is sort of defined by its struggle against mainstream gay and lesbian politics, which seeks rights and inclusion within a middle-class framework, whereas queer liberationist politics is more of what I would call a bottoms-up politic, where we believe in the idea that the liberation of all has to come from the liberation of those on the bottom first. So that's one major thing. Another significant piece of activism and art that I was involved in was I was involved in the organizing of a conference called No More Apologies, which was a conference to bring together queer, cis, and trans women to discuss our place within the community. Often trans women are actively excluded, somewhat violently, from women's spaces, particularly queer women's spaces. And there's been an ongoing history of that for about 40 years now, since the publication of Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male. And so No More Apologies was a chance to bring people together. And unfortunately, some of the response to No More Apologies was that a group of self-proclaimed radical feminists online attacked me and the other organizers, creating dozens of hate websites about us, in which they labeled us, not only labeled us men, but labeled us rapists for saying that trans women were women. They created a petition attempting to bully Planned Parenthood into not allowing me to be a speaker at Planned Parenthood Toronto. And they even went after my boyfriend at the time and outed him at his job, where he was a teen librarian in rural Michigan, and attempted to get him fired from his job. And he almost did lose his job. And so for several months I was consumed with trying to make both activist and artistic responses. And one of the artistic responses that came out of me was a 40-minute long endurance performance piece called Say It to My Face, in which I stand at the front of a room naked and projected onto my body are video images of the hateful comments left online about me that are like calling for me to be killed, that are saying that I'm a man, that I'm gonna rape people, like all these horrible things. And participants in the audience are invited to come up to me, and right in front of me there's a microphone, and they're handed a piece of paper with one of the actual comments on it, and said to read, and told to read what's on the paper out loud into the microphone, and then look me in the eyes. And for 40 minutes I just stand there without any reaction or movement. It was quite a difficult performance to do, and has gone on to spark a lot of discussions in online activist communities, particularly in trans activist communities through the website Tumblr. So that was kind of a significant place for me.
Mm-hmm. What an experience.
Yeah.
Both in real life and the performance itself, to go through something like that.
Totally.
Wow. I'm going to go a little bit off script for a second. I want to react to your first story too.
Yeah.
Like, wow. For a couple of things. I mean, Davina knows. I mean, I live in that neighborhood, and I've had issue with that with my own neighbors doing what they were doing, and it was disturbing for a lot of us as well that was happening.
What's really disturbing about the Homewood-Maitland situation is that it's not an isolated incident. So in the early 2000s, a similar incident happened in Vancouver, in which a group of middle-class, mostly white, gay cis men attacked trans sex workers in their neighborhood and literally drove them out of the neighborhood. And the same thing happened in Montreal as well, where baseball bats were used to attack trans sex workers working on Sainte Catherine by another group of gay, identified, mostly white, cisgender men. So it's very disturbing, the Homewood situation, because of what it says about the ongoing tensions within LGBT communities along political lines as well as along gender and sexuality lines.
For sure. Okay. How would you define your role in the queer movement?
I would define my role in the queer movement as a loudmouth who doesn't know when to stop. I'm kind of a person who, despite having no formal education, has a lot of opinions about a lot of things and just won't shut up until everyone listens to them. So that's pretty much my position within the queer liberationist movement.
Okay, great. And how would you define queer liberation?
Queer liberation for me is separate from what I would think of as mainstream gay and lesbian politics. So mainstream gay and lesbian politics is very concerned with obtaining human rights and creating hate crimes bills and these sorts of things that would allow cisgender gays and lesbians to be able to get the rights that they feel they would otherwise be entitled to if it weren't for this one characteristic about them being gay or lesbian that keeps them from these things. And I think queer liberationist politics is a recognition of the fact that most of us still wouldn't get those rights even if we did that. And it's a call to question the usefulness of those rights. How useful is it if the only people who can access them are all white and middle class and educated, you know? If you're trans, if you're a woman, if you're a sex worker, if you're a person of color, if you live below the poverty line, those rights will never be accessible to you. So queer liberationist politics is an acknowledgement of that and an attempt to base all of our politics in the idea that we have to make everyone have better life options, not just the privileged few.
Okay, that's great. I can see why you were chosen. I sometimes worry I'm going to law school, but I sometimes worry.
I told you.
Yeah. I sometimes worry in our work, in our work with Queer Ontario, is that people don't, which is what spurred this project, that people don't quite understand our politics at Queer Ontario. They see us as angry and challenging and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, are you in favor of anything is what I get a question.
No, I hate everything.
And so it's refreshing to hear a young person just get it, know it, you know, and whereas I don't have to feel like I have to keep educating constantly, right?
Yeah.
So it's excellent. It's good. So with that, how is queer liberation expressed in your activism, arts, and I'll add to service provision?
For me, expressing queer liberationist politics means centering the issues and experiences of the most marginalized people. And so anytime I think about queer rights or trans rights, I immediately have to think about the ways that sex work is criminalized in Canada, the ways that HIV non-disclosure are criminalized in Canada. I have to think about the ways that racism and xenophobia play out all across Canadian society. So for me, it's really about looking at things intersectionally as best as I can and trying to check my own privileges where they exist. Yeah, and just like, well, I think one of the problems I have expressing my queer liberationist politics is through my professional service provision work, where I'm often constrained in how much I'm allowed to say and what sorts of fights I'm allowed to fight. And that's been an ongoing tension in my life when you have sort of a radical activist who is then forced into an institutional context. It's like fitting a square peg in a round hole. It's just not going to work right for everyone. So that's kind of an ongoing tension.
Yeah, and I know entirely what you're talking about there. There's an ongoing struggle with that. I'm just wondering for the audience's perspective, maybe if you can elaborate on what those constraints are like when you are working in the service industry.
Sure. This is totally something I wanted to touch on. So one of the problems with queer politics is that like many activist movements, we have been sucked up into an ongoing non-profitization of our work. And while this has provided us some really important structures that allow us to provide basic services to trans people and queer people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access these things, not to mention also providing actual money for the people doing this work, being involved in the nonprofit industrial complex, as some might call it, means being constrained in many ways. You have to be very careful what you say so that the funding for your program isn't cut. And this ongoing fear of where the money is coming from and who's going to be offended by whatever it is that's going to come out of my big mouth is where the problems lie. It drives a lot of management positions to come down quite harshly on those doing the frontline work, who are often the ones with the most radical political analysis. As well, because we're involved in this nonprofit industrial complex that's constantly seeking money, the organizations and institutions we work for, in order to get that money, have to project an image. And that image most often must appeal to the people with money. And that's funders, that's governments, that's corporations. And so we can see that the kinds of work we get to do and the kinds of advocacy we get to do and even who we get to provide services to get constrained by the whims of these outside sources who are often straight, almost definitely white, always cisgender. And so there just isn't really a space to project a queer liberationist politic and to come at things in a way that is more than a Band-Aid solution. What funders want to see are Band-Aid solutions. They want to see a meal drop-in, but they don't want to see something that actually addresses the structural inequalities that create food insecurity. And that's the problem, you know? Or at least that's very indicative of the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's great. Very good response. I kind of work in that area, so I just thought, oh, good to hear it come up from someone else too. So, okay, so we've completed the questions that we've asked everyone, and so I'm going to move on to your choice questions. And your first one comes under the category of history, where we ask here, what are the most pivotal moments in our histories, and what can we learn from them?
So I think when we think about queer liberationist politics, the first most pivotal moment that we have to think of is Stonewall. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Stonewall, in theory. And Stonewall, the Stonewall riots, hopefully most people know what they are, but they were a series of direct actions against the police violence experienced at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, where police raided this inn, as they do to many other queer and trans establishments, and still do to this day. And that particular night, people were not taking it, and a group of trans women of color involved in sex work, as well as drag queens and some gay men and some lesbians, rose up against the police and rioted for days. And it was amazing, and we love it. And we celebrate it every year with Pride celebrations. Now, what's really interesting about this is that because of this event and the importance that's being ascribed to it, it's erased the history that came before that. So for example, 3 years before that, in 1966 in San Francisco, there was an event called the Compton's Cafeteria Riots, in which a group of trans women sex workers, mostly women of color, rose up against police in a very similar way. And that never really gets talked about, except very recently. As well, the event of Stonewall has been co-opted primarily by white, cisgender, gay and lesbian rights activists and purged of all of the people who were actually there. So there's books and movies about Stonewall that don't even mention the fact that the people doing the most work at Stonewall were trans women, were street queens, were people of color, were sex workers. You don't hear that. You hear the story of how gay and lesbian white people saved everyone, and it was so great. So I think that's a really pivotal moment in thinking about queer liberation politics, particularly in the ways that it's being co-opted. And that co-optation happened so quickly. By 1973, Sylvia Rivera, a trans woman activist who had been at Stonewall, was forcibly removed from the gay activist movement. She had been influential in forming some of the most important gay liberation organizations such as Gay Activists Alliance and Gay Liberation Front. Yet by 1973, when she showed up to the Gay Pride Parade, she was assaulted by gay male activist Vito Russo when she attempted to go on stage, and then a lesbian activist read out a long statement against trans women. And when she finally fought her way onto the stage, they even took the microphone stand from her. And that didn't stop her though, because Sylvia Rivera was really fucking amazing. And she still managed to deliver a speech that to this day would be considered radical, in which she talks about criminalization and the ways that mainstream gays and lesbians have completely ignored the needs of queer and trans people in prison and dealing with poverty and homelessness and sex work. So again, really pivotal moment. Another pivotal moment that I have to think of is the founding of ACT UP, a radical organization fighting for a cure and for political attention towards the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, and ongoing, they still exist. And unfortunately, this organization who did such incredible work, we can see was, especially in the beginning, almost exclusively white. There were no trans people involved in it, particularly near the beginning. There was absolutely none. In fact, Vito Russo, the man who beat up Sylvia Rivera when she tried to get on stage in 1973 at Gay Pride, was one of the founders of ACT UP. So we can see the ways that trans women and people of color were actively excluded from this movement, and as a result, to this day, have massively disproportionate seroprevalence rates, so HIV rates. So that's another really important moment. Looking at Canada specifically, one of the moments that I always look to in the Canadian context is Victoria Day 1996. On Victoria Day 1996, a man named Marcelo Palma shot and killed 2 trans women sex workers and 1 cis woman sex worker, the 2 trans women in the Homewood-Maitland neighborhood. And when he was finally caught, he said he killed them because he saw sex workers and street people to be scum of the earth. This is a really pivotal moment in trans history in Canada. It was a huge crisis in which the trans community didn't know what to do with itself, and as a result organized. We can see that organizations such as the 519 Church Street Community Center engaged with activists to create the first multi-services for trans people in the whole country, the first ones to ever address homelessness and poverty among trans people, and violence against sex workers, and all these sorts of things. But again, this is a really interesting moment because we can see that this was a moment that was also usurped by institutions. And so activists were taken, radical activists were taken into conservative institutions and attempted to be molded into a less radical agenda. So I think that's also a pivotal moment when we think about queer liberation in Canada. Certainly that's the moment that I always think of.
Okay, great. And just jumping down, the next category that you chose a question from was rights-based claims, troubling equality. And the question you asked for is, are we critical of rights-based claims? And if so, on what other basis do we seek equity?
Mm-hmm. So, I think that human rights are useless in a queer liberationist politic. I do not think that they are remotely useful for queer or trans people, and let me tell you why. Human rights are a bunch of fancy words written on really fine paper by legislators after an arduous process of trying to get them to acknowledge that we're people. If we spend all of our activist efforts trying to convince people that we're people, instead of coming from the position that we are inherently people and our personhood, our humanness, is not dependent on the approval, the acceptance, the tolerance of these straight, white, cisgender politicians, then we can do something entirely radical and different, you know? So I think human rights fail because they do not account for, let me say this differently. Human rights fail because the only people who can access them are people who still have some amount of privilege. To go through a human rights claim, you have to usually hire an expensive human rights lawyer, go through a lengthy tribunal process, and at the end of the day, you have to prove that discrimination happened. This is a process that can only happen after the fact. Proving that discrimination happened is damn near impossible. If I go for an interview, and I give a relatively good interview, and my resume is relatively good, but they don't say anything transphobic, then how can I prove that they didn't hire me on the basis of my gender identity or gender expression, or my sexual orientation? Those of us who have multiple intersections of identity, how can you prove which one it was is the magic card that didn't get you the job or get you the housing? And furthermore, it does nothing to address the fact that most of us, at least trans people, most of us don't have good resumes to begin with because we can't get hired in the first place. So we can't even prove that we would be reasonable candidates for a job because we're kept out of the jobs in the first place. So it's not useful. It's also a strategy that only works after the fact. It does nothing to address things before they happen. It does absolutely nothing to address things before they happen. As well, it's often tied into a discourse around creating anti-hate crimes legislation, so-called protections. These anti-hate crimes legislation are meant to increase the penalties faced by people who commit violence and harassment, for example, against queer or trans people. But this is a problem because, first of all, to access them, you have to go to the police and actually report that incidents happen. And what we know is that queer people, and most especially trans people, often face open ridiculing from police, violence from police, maybe falsely arrested when they're trying to report a crime themselves. So how can we even go to the police to access these so-called protections? And what violent homophobe or transphobe thinks, oh, you know what? I just read in the paper, there's anti-hate crimes bills, I better not go beat up that homosexual over there. No one stops to think that. So what does it do proactively to actually prevent things from happening? And then, if you do report it to the police, and you take it to a court.
Okay.
All right. So let's say that you do take hate crime to the police, and by some stroke of magic, you actually end up in the court system, then we're forcing queer and trans people to interact with the criminal punishment system. And in my opinion, that's not something we should want to do. We're expanding the criminal punishment system. We're trying to put people in prison for longer. We know, if you look at statistics, that the longer you're in prison, the higher the chance of recidivism. So it's not going to help anyone or stop any more violence from happening to throw people in prison for longer, particularly in a prison system that is set up to punish, both historically and currently, queer and trans people. Why do we want to engage in that? Why is that what we should be engaged in? So I think we have to fight for rights in terms of securing really material things. We have to fight for the decriminalization of sex work and HIV non-disclosure, which account for so many of the arrests of queer and trans people in this country. And we have to fight for things like access to health care, access to safe school environments. We have to fight for access to food. Food security is a huge thing, and people don't think about that as a queer trans issue, but it's such a vital queer trans issue. The queer people and trans people I know are more often than not living below the poverty line and need to access things like food banks. Why don't we look at things like how much we're giving people on OW and ODSP and these other social welfare mechanisms, and actually increase those things so that people are able to have their basics met, you know? I think those are places where queer liberation politics need to happen and will have a much more lasting effect than the creation of some fancy human rights legislation on paper we'll never be able to access.
Very good. That's great. That's great. And you move on to another category that you chose, and that's intersectionality. Mm-hmm. And here you've chosen the question, does queer liberation intersect with other social locations? And we have a series of examples here: race, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, disability, class, etc. And you can choose therein what you want to talk about.
Mm-hmm. I think queer liberationist politics, by necessity, has to include an intersectional analysis. We can't talk about the liberation of queer people as being successful unless trans people are also liberated, unless women are liberated, unless people of color are liberated, unless there is an end to the prison industrial complex, and all of these other issues. I think that's one of the exciting parts about queer liberationist politics, is the chance to really look at things broadly and look at the fact that most queer people and most trans people face intersections of violence and structural inequalities in our lives that cannot be addressed by a single issue politic.
Okay, very good, very good. And you chose today and tomorrow. I think you chose one here that most happens because it's got an A here.
Oh no, I added that in on my own computer because I was like making notes.
The A?
Yeah, the A.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Because I was going to say, that doesn't look familiar to me.
Yeah, no,
Okay, all right.
that was just things that was going on about
Okay.
myself.
I'll read the question if you want to look at this. If you want to look at your notes, you can do that.
Sure.
In the back. But so our question was that you chose, are there aspects of queer liberation that you consider to be detrimental or a disservice to the movement? I want to read what you added.
Okay, so I think places where queer liberationist politics run into trouble and sometimes fail include the isolating of queer liberation within academic spaces. Almost the only people I know who talk about it using words like that, or any of the words that I hear people use, always come out of university contexts. And so there's this failure to actually connect with the majority of the people facing the highest burden of discrimination. And so that's a huge disadvantage to me personally. I think that if we are to have a politics that works, we have to have a politics that is accessible to the most marginalized people and led by the most marginalized people. As well, one of the other problems with queer liberationist politics and the surrounding culture around that is the privileging of masculinity at the detriment of femininity and feminine identified people. So we can see, for example, that most people leading queer political organizations are men, butch identified lesbians, and trans men, etc. We rarely see trans women involved in these spaces, despite the fact that if you look back historically at places like Stonewall, where queer liberationist politics supposedly came out of, that was all led by trans women. So why the disconnect? Where are trans women in this politic? That's a huge problem. And femmes in general, etc. Like, there's such a hyper-masculinizing of queer culture, even the most radical aspects of queer culture. And part of this also plays out in the ways that this interacts with the academic structures of queer liberationist politics. So we find that one of the reasons trans women often aren't involved is because trans women don't go to school for gender studies or queer studies or women's studies or whatever that most of the people involved in queer organizing have gone to school for. Yet trans men disproportionately go to school for those things. So that's a huge disconnect, and one of the major problems with the ongoing relationship between queer politics and academia. As well, one of the disadvantages of queer liberationist politics, or one of the failures, has been our ongoing non-profitization, where, and I spoke about this earlier, but queer activists keep getting rolled up within the non-profit industrial complex, and the way that this constrains our politics and makes it difficult for us to actually do solid and important work. So that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. I totally understand this whole nonprofit industrial complex issue. Mm-hmm. And what some are also terming, there's that terminology that some are terming what's happened to our movement as the professionalization of our movement as well. In our last interview, we made the comment about if you're spending all your time running the office and not actually meeting your goals, he goes, then you have to question what is the point? What are you doing? And even for us at Queer Ontario, we don't have an office, but we spend a lot of time running the organization, like without an office. Yeah. And we always have to come back to why are we even gathered in the first place? Rather than the agendas and the minutes and the
Yeah, you always have to relook at your goals and see how you're doing, because you can really get caught up in the bureaucracy.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you had another question. You chose in the same category today and tomorrow. What do you see as the most important fronts for our movements going forward?
I think if we are truly to have a queer liberationist politic, the most important things we need to be working on are the decriminalization of sex work, the decriminalization of HIV non-disclosure, and prison abolition. It's so, so important, and these issues are often ignored and painted as not queer problems, right? And how offensive to say that HIV is not a queer problem, how offensive to say that sex work is not a trans issue, how offensive to say that prisons are not queer or trans issues. It's so important that we address these things because we are speaking about the most marginalized segments of our communities. And if we truly believe in what I like to call a bottoms-up approach to politics, in which we see liberation as only coming if the most marginalized are liberated, then we have to be looking at the ways that criminalization in prisons and policing impact our lives on a daily basis. This is particularly true for trans people who face policing every single day of our lives, where even if you're not a sex worker, you can be walking down the street and the police can stop you and look in your bag, and if they find condoms, they can and will use that against you in a charge for solicitation, even if you're not a sex worker. And then if you are a sex worker, so much the worse, So we have to look at these things, and we can see that all of the intersections of identities play out the harshest when we look at criminalization and prisons. One of the failures of the queer movement so far has been the complete lack of attention paid to the lives of queer people in prison and trans people in prison. We have trans women in men's prisons who get beaten and raped, or given the option of going into solitary confinement, which the UN has ruled a form of torture, in which they are still beaten and raped, but this time by corrections officers, And also have no access to healthcare. So we have trans women and queer people in prison who are living with HIV who get taken off their HIV meds because they're in prison, and then they get sick. And maybe some of them die because they can't get their HIV meds, and yet this hasn't been centered as a queer issue. So I feel like these are the places where we need to start having more serious, not only conversations, but direct action to change what's going on with how the police are attacking our communities and how laws are regulating our communities and how prisons are killing our communities. That's what I think.
Okay, very good. Very good. And so we come to the very last question we ask everyone, and that is, given the questions asked and the discussion we just had, are there any further comments or thoughts you would like to share before we end the interview?
Final thoughts. No, I think we're good. I think I ranted for a long time. You probably got something usable in there.
Oh, I think so. I think so. I'm just taking a moment. As you were thinking, I was thinking, if I can ask you to elaborate, because this is early in the interview, you said something about, you were distinguishing a bit, and you did it quite well there, it was quite usable, but if you want to elaborate further, distinguishing the difference between the queer liberation movement versus the more mainstream LGBT movement, and what I often call the kind of acceptability, respectability within the hetero-sexist framework, that they seem to be heading down that path, and yet queer liberation's over here. Did you want to elaborate a bit about these tensions in our movement as a whole?
Sure, totally. So I would say the mainstream LGBT movement has been very concerned with securing things like human rights legislation, anti-hate crime provisions, gay marriage, gays in the military, all of these things that cisgender, white, middle-class, gay and lesbian people feel that they would otherwise be entitled to if but for the fact that they were queer. And so I think queer liberationist politics is a radical resistance and response to that, to be like, actually, maybe we don't want to be part of these structures that are killing people around the world. Maybe we don't want to do things the way straight people do them. I have no desire to be straight. I don't want to be straight. I don't want to live a straight life. I am interested in developing my own life and developing a really queer life. And for me, a queer life does not include gays in the military. That's just a horrible thing. Why do we want to go to another country and kill people at the whims of straight people, largely over arguments about money? Why are we doing that? That's not very queer. So I think queer liberation is really about resisting and coming up with alternate strategies for the existing systems. And recognizing, I think queer liberation is a recognition that most queer and trans people will not be free just because white middle class people are free. Because the majority of us still have to deal with things like classism, sexism, xenophobia, etc. So queer liberation is a question and a challenge to all of those systems, to be like, we don't want to be part of your system. We want to tear your system down. We want to burn your institutions to the ground and salt the earth and start over somewhere else. That's what we want to do, in my opinion.
I have one more I can go with. Because you're triggering different things, and so you mentioned once or twice and just now as well the issue of same-sex marriage. So you talked about the military a little bit and why queers probably would not want to, be advocating for that. And you know, your thoughts, especially coming from a young person, because when at the height of that movement towards same-sex marriage, you know, I bristled when I heard some of the proponents, some of the activists for it saying, we owe it to our young people to do this so that we're creating options for them. I was like, so I have a young person in front of me, and you know, what are your thoughts about same-sex marriage?
So I think same-sex marriage is great and all, and if people want to go out and get married, good for you. But I don't think that it's something we should be spending all of our political time, efforts, and money on. I think the problem with gay marriage is the way that it usurped all of queer politics. So that the only thing we could talk about, the only thing that straight people could conceptualize as a problem for queer people was whether or not we could get married just like them. There's no room then to talk about the fact that the privileges we afford to married couples are based in oppressive institutions that are inherently anti-women. Why would we want to be involved in that? So while as a feminist, I am all for giving people lots of choices and options in life, and if people want to go get gay married, have fun, I don't think it's something we should be wasting our political time, efforts, and resources on, because we have more pressing issues. If we spend all of our time on that, then we don't have time to talk about the fact that queer people are in prisons. We don't have the time to talk about the fact that trans youth are on the street more than any other population of youth. We don't have any time to talk about that because we're all like, oh, we gotta get married. So, you know, knock yourself out if you want to get married, but don't like take away all of our political time to devote to this issue. I don't care. And I feel like most young queer, and especially trans people I know, feel very similarly that we aren't terribly concerned with gay marriage because it's joining part of an institution that wants us out in the first place. I don't want to join an institution that doesn't want me there. I want to create institutions that are based in wanting me there. So, you know, that's one perspective on gay marriage.
One I love, so you know. That's great. I didn't have anything more. I don't know.
You covered so much more.
Yes. Covered the ground very well. This was a very good. That's great.
Excellent.
Thank you for participating.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah.
It's going to really add some good.
Yes, exactly.
What's your timeline for putting together the documentary side of things?
Well, at this point, we have quite a bit of work going forward, and our hope is to premiere.
It's not our hope. We're premiering a year this spring for Inside Out. So next Inside Out, we've already been accepted, and yeah, so we're gonna have it done, you know, November-ish, and we're gonna get everybody together for a screening. And so that if any, you know, a little bit of input, we might do some tweaking after if necessary.
Yeah. So participants will have an opportunity to see what we put together before we actually premiere it. And if, based on your feedback, it's going to be an open process too. Not so open that people tell us, you know, any major changes, but more around, you know, what are your impressions? What is your sense? Do you think we need a little bit more of this or a little less of that, or what have you? And then we can go back, tweak it a bit, and just finalize it, and then actually premiere it at Inside Out. So that's the intent for next spring.
And then, of course, we're going to move on to other festivals as well.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for letting me.
Yes, thank you for participating.
It was fun.
And I don't know, did you sign